I used to believe that love was enough, that if you gave everything you had, if you showed up every single time, if you swallowed your pride and kept your heart open despite the bruises, eventually that love would be returned. I was wrong about so many things. My name is Barbara, and at 55, I've learned that some silences speak louder than any words ever could. The silence of my phone that never rings anymore. The silence of birthday dinners where my chair remains empty. Not because it wasn't offered, but because the invitation never came. The silence of a daughter-in-law who smiles politely when we accidentally meet at the grocery store, then hurries past with my grandson, a child who used to run to me with sticky fingers and endless stories, but now barely remembers my name. If you enjoy stories about real people facing real struggles, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to us. And please comment with what city you're watching from. It helps us know we're reaching people who understand these kinds of heartaches. The worst part about being pushed out of your own family isn't the dramatic moment when it happens. There's no big fight, no slamming doors, no harsh words that cut through the air like knives. Instead, it's the slow erosion of your place in their lives, grain by grain, until one day you realize you've become a stranger in the story you helped write. It started 3 years ago when my son Michael married Jessica. She was beautiful, ambitious, everything I wasn't. A corporate lawyer with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. During their engagement, I tried so hard to connect with her. I offered to help with wedding planning, suggested family recipes for the reception, even offered to pay for the flowers because I knew they were stretching their budget. "That's so sweet of you, Barbara," she would say, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're humoring a child. "But we've already hired a professional planner. We want everything to be coordinated." Coordinated. The word hung in the air like a judgment. I wasn't coordinated enough for their new life. My homemade offerings weren't sophisticated enough for their vision. My presence somehow disrupted the perfect picture they were trying to create. The wedding day should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. I'd raised Michael alone after his father died when he was 12, worked double shifts at the diner to pay for his college, celebrated every achievement, and comforted him through every setback. But at the reception, I found myself seated at a table in the back corner with distant relatives I'd never met, watching my son dance with his new wife while Jessica's parents sat at the head table where I should have been. When I asked Michael about the seating arrangement later, he shifted uncomfortably and said, "Mom, you know Jessica's family is larger than ours. We had to make some difficult decisions about space." Space. As if love could be measured in square footage. As if 18 years of sacrifice could be reduced to a seating chart logistics problem. The distance grew wider after little Tommy was born. I remember the first time I held my grandson, this perfect, tiny miracle with Michael's nose and my father's stubborn chin. My heart exploded with love so fierce it took my breath away. I wanted to be the grandmother who baked cookies and told stories, who babysat on date nights and spoiled him with toys his parents would pretend to disapprove of. But Jessica had other plans. There were schedules to maintain, sleep routines that couldn't be disrupted, dietary restrictions I couldn't possibly understand without a background in child development. When I offered to babysit, she would smile that same distant smile and say, "Oh, that's so generous. But we have a nanny service we use. They're trained in infant CPR and early childhood development." Trained, professional, qualified, words that made my decades of mothering experience feel amateur and inadequate. The visits became shorter, then less frequent, then practically non-existent. When I called, Jessica would answer with that bright, fake cheerfulness that made my stomach clench. "Oh, hi, Barbara. What a surprise. We're just heading out to baby yoga class, but I'll tell Michael you called." Baby yoga class. In my day, babies got exercise by crawling around the living room floor and reaching for dust bunnies their mothers had missed. But apparently, I was from my day, and my day was over. I started sending gifts instead, carefully chosen toys, beautiful clothes in the next size up, books I'd loved reading to Michael when he was small. Sometimes I would get a polite thank you text weeks later. "Thanks for the outfit, Mom. Very thoughtful." No photo of Tommy wearing it. No invitation to see him enjoy the toy. No connection beyond the bare minimum of acknowledgement. The final blow came last Christmas. I'd been planning for months, saving money from my part-time job at the library to buy Tommy a beautiful wooden train set I'd seen him admiring at the toy store. I imagined us sitting on the floor together, building tracks and making choo-choo sounds, creating memories that would last both our lifetimes. When I arrived at their house on Christmas morning, my arms full of carefully wrapped presents, Jessica met me at the door with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Barbara, I'm so sorry. Tommy's not feeling well, and we're trying to keep things quiet today. Maybe we could reschedule?" Through the window behind her, I could see the living room full of Jessica's family, her parents, her sister's children, everyone laughing and opening presents around a tree that blazed with expensive ornaments. Tommy sat in the middle of it all, completely healthy, squealing with delight as he tore through wrapping paper. I stood there on the doorstep, holding gifts that suddenly felt foolish in my hands, watching my grandson celebrate Christmas with the family that mattered, while I remained locked outside like an unwelcome stranger. "Of course," I heard myself saying, my voice steady despite the fracture spreading through my chest. "I hope he feels better soon." I drove home through empty streets decorated with lights and joy that belonged to other families, and spent Christmas Day alone with a frozen dinner, and the crushing realization that I had become disposable in the life I'd helped create. The months that followed that Christmas were a masterclass in how relationships die, not with dramatic explosions, but with 1,000 tiny cuts that slowly bleed the life out of what you once thought was unbreakable. I tried to adapt. God help me. I tried so hard to become the kind of grandmother Jessica would approve of. I bought books on modern parenting techniques, researched age-appropriate toys, even signed up for a computer class at the community center so I could send better emails and maybe video call with Tommy. I thought if I could just speak their language, if I could prove I was keeping up with the times, maybe they would let me back in. I was fooling myself. The next time I called, Michael answered, a rare occurrence that filled me with hope until I heard the exhaustion in his voice. "Hi, Mom. Listen, this isn't a great time. Tommy's been fussy, and Jessica's working on a big case, and we're all just stretched thin right now." "I could come help," I offered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I could watch Tommy for a few hours while Jessica works, or make dinner, or just—" "Mom." His voice carried a note I'd never heard before, irritation mixed with something that sounded dangerously close to pity. "We've got it handled. Jessica's very particular about Tommy's routine, and introducing changes right now would just make things more difficult for everyone." More difficult. I was the complication they needed to manage, the problem that required careful handling. 25 years of being his anchor, his supporter, his biggest champion, and I had become an inconvenience. "Of course," I said, that familiar phrase that had become my default response to rejection. "I understand." But I didn't understand. How could 18 years of midnight fevers and homework help and proud cheering from soccer sidelines be reduced to this polite distance? How could the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms now find my presence disruptive to his perfectly orchestrated life? I started paying attention to social media, something I'd never cared about before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Jessica posted constantly. Pictures of Tommy's first steps, his attempts at eating solid food, family outings to parks and museums. In photo after photo, I watched my grandson grow and change, marking milestones I should have witnessed in person, but experienced instead through filtered images on a screen. The comments section was always full of praise from Jessica's friends and family. "What a perfect little family. You're such an amazing mom. Tommy is so lucky to have you both." I would stare at these pictures, zooming in on Tommy's face, searching for resemblances to Michael or my late husband, trying to feel connected to this child who was growing up without knowing me. I never commented. What could I say? I'm his grandmother, and I barely know him? I bought him a Christmas present he'll never receive? I love him desperately from a distance you've carefully constructed? The words would sound pathetic, needy, everything Jessica had probably already decided I was. Sometimes I would see Michael tagged in photos from work events or couples' nights out. He looked happy, successful, surrounded by people in expensive clothes sharing expensive meals. This was the life he'd chosen, the version of himself he preferred, polished, sophisticated, unencumbered by the working-class mother who had raised him in a cramped apartment above a dry cleaner. I began to notice that he never mentioned me in interviews for his company newsletter or when coworkers asked about family. When his college friend got married and posted old photos from their graduation, there I was in several pictures, proud, beaming, wearing my best dress that still looked cheap next to the other parents' outfits. But when these photos appeared online, I had been carefully cropped out or was conveniently standing behind someone else. It was as if they were slowly erasing me from his history, editing out the inconvenient truth of where he came from and who had made his success possible. The breaking point came on Tommy's second birthday. I had spent weeks planning, saving money for a special gift, imagining myself singing "Happy Birthday" and watching him blow out candles. I called 2 weeks in advance to make sure I could attend. "Actually, Mom, we're keeping it really small this year," Michael said, his voice carrying that same careful tone people use when delivering bad news they've rehearsed. "Just immediate family. Jessica's parents are flying in, and her sister will be there with her kids, so it's going to be pretty crowded already." Immediate family. The words hit like a physical blow. Jessica's parents, who lived across the country and saw Tommy maybe twice a year, qualified as immediate family. But I, the woman who had given birth to his father, who had sacrificed everything to raise him, who had loved Tommy since before he was born, was not immediate enough to warrant an invitation to my own grandson's birthday party. "I see," I managed to say, though I couldn't see anything through the tears that suddenly blurred my vision. "Well, maybe I could just stop by afterward. Just for a few minutes to give him his present?" The pause that followed lasted an eternity. I could practically hear Michael calculating how to refuse this request without sounding completely heartless. "The thing is, Mom, by the time everyone leaves, Tommy will probably be exhausted and ready for bed. Maybe we could arrange something the following weekend? Just the three of us?" The following weekend never came, of course. There was always something. Tommy was teething, Jessica was working late. They had plans with friends from Jessica's office. The excuses became a routine, as predictable as they were painful. I started driving by their house sometimes, just to see the lights on and know they were there, living their lives just 5 miles away from my tiny apartment, but might as well have been on another planet. I never stopped, never knocked. I just needed proof that they existed, that this family I loved so desperately was real and not just a cruel dream I couldn't wake up from. One evening, I saw them loading Tommy into the car, probably heading to dinner or some family-friendly event. Tommy had grown so much. His hair was longer, his legs stronger, his whole demeanor more confident and animated. I watched my son lift him into his car seat with the practiced ease of daily routine, saw Jessica lean over to kiss Tommy's forehead before closing the car door. They looked complete, perfect, happy. A family unit that functioned beautifully without any need for the woman who had made it all possible. That night, I sat in my empty apartment and tried to remember the last time any of them had asked how I was doing, whether I was lonely, if I needed anything. I couldn't recall a single instance. In their world, I had become a background character in my own story, present when convenient, absent when inconvenient, and entirely forgotten in between. The silence that surrounded me wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of mattering, of being seen, of existing in any meaningful way to the people I loved most in the world. I decided to try harder. Looking back now, I realize how pathetic that sounds. A grown woman begging for scraps of attention from her own family, but desperation makes you do things that shame would normally prevent. I convinced myself that if I could just prove my worth, if I could show them how valuable I could be, they would remember why they needed me. I started small. When I learned through Facebook that Jessica had been promoted to senior associate at her law firm, I sent a congratulations card with a heartfelt note about how proud I was of her achievements. I meant every word. Despite everything, I genuinely admired her success and wanted to support her. The card disappeared into silence. No thank you, no acknowledgement, nothing. When Michael posted about struggling with a difficult client at his accounting firm, I called to offer encouragement and maybe share some perspective from my years of dealing with difficult customers at the diner. The conversation lasted exactly 4 minutes and ended with him saying he had to take another call. The phone never rang with a return call. I volunteered to help when Jessica mentioned on social media that she was overwhelmed trying to balance work and motherhood. I offered everything I could think of: grocery shopping, house cleaning, laundry, anything that might ease her burden and prove my usefulness. Her response came through Michael, delivered with the gentle tone people use when explaining something to a child who doesn't understand adult complexities. "Mom, Jessica really appreciates the offer, but she's got systems in place that work for her. Adding another person to the mix right now would just create more coordination challenges than it would solve." Coordination challenges. I had become a logistical problem requiring management rather than a mother offering love and support to her family. But I persisted, because giving up felt like admitting that 25 years of motherhood had been meaningless. I researched Tommy's developmental milestones and bought educational toys designed to enhance cognitive development. I found a beautiful wooden puzzle featuring farm animals, the kind of classic toy that would last for years, and maybe even become a treasured keepsake. When I presented it to Jessica during one of my brief scheduled visits, appointments that felt more like consultations than family time, she examined it with the thoroughness of a quality control inspector. "It's lovely, Barbara," she said, turning the puzzle over to read the small print on the back. "But Tommy's pediatrician has been very specific about avoiding toys with small parts until he's older, and we're trying to limit his exposure to gender-stereotyped imagery right now. Farm animals can reinforce traditional agricultural narratives that might not align with his future interests." I stared at her, holding this simple wooden puzzle that had seemed so perfect in the store, now transformed into evidence of my ignorance about modern child-rearing philosophies. The farm animals I'd thought were charming were apparently problematic. The size I'd considered appropriate was dangerous. My gift had become another example of how out of touch I was with their world. "Of course," I said, taking the puzzle back with hands that trembled slightly. "I should have asked first." "It's really thoughtful," Jessica continued, her voice carrying that particular brand of kindness that somehow made you feel worse than outright cruelty would have. "Maybe we could save it for when he's older? I'll put it away somewhere safe." Somewhere safe meant somewhere I would never see it again, and we both knew it. The visits became exercises in walking through a minefield where every step might trigger an explosion of disapproval. I learned to bring nothing, say little, and leave quickly. I would sit on their expensive couch in their perfectly decorated living room, watching Tommy play with toys I hadn't chosen, listening to conversations about people I didn't know, feeling like an intruder in a scene where I didn't belong. During one particularly painful visit, Jessica's mother called while I was there. I watched Jessica's face light up in a way it never did when she saw my number on her phone. She talked animatedly about Tommy's latest achievements, describing his new words and funny habits with the enthusiasm of someone sharing precious information with someone who mattered. "Oh, he's sitting right here." Jessica laughed into the phone. "Do you want to say hi to Grandma Diane?" "Tommy, say hi to Grandma." Tommy babbled happily into the phone, performing for his important grandmother who lived far away, but somehow maintained a connection I couldn't achieve despite living 5 miles away. I sat 3 feet from this conversation, invisible and forgotten, watching my grandson bond with a woman who was apparently a more acceptable version of what grandmothers should be. When the call ended, Jessica turned to me with that bright, empty smile. "Sorry about that. Diane likes to call during Tommy's active time so she can hear all his new sounds." Diane got scheduled calls during Tommy's best hours. I got brief visits during his nap time or right before his bath, when he was tired and cranky and uninterested in interacting with the strange woman who appeared occasionally in his peripheral vision. The final humiliation came during Easter. I had hoped, foolishly, desperately, that they might invite me to join them for dinner, or at least an egg hunt with Tommy. Instead, I learned through Jessica's Instagram posts that they had spent the day at Diane's sister's house, surrounded by Jessica's extended family, creating memories and traditions that had no place for me. The photos were beautiful and painful. Tommy in a little bow tie, hunting for eggs in a garden I'd never seen. surrounded by people who got to claim the title of family, while I remained exiled to the category of inconvenient obligation. I called that evening, ostensibly to wish them a happy Easter, but really to hear my son's voice and confirm that I still existed in his world, even marginally. "Oh, hi, Mom," Michael said, and I could hear the sounds of a dinner party in the background. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses. "We're actually in the middle of dessert. Can I call you back later?" Later never came, of course. It never did anymore. That night, I sat in my apartment looking at those Instagram photos, zooming in on Tommy's face and trying to memorize the shape of his smile, the way his hair had grown, the confident way he toddled across unfamiliar grass. He was thriving without me, growing and learning and becoming his own little person in a world where I was absent. I began to understand that this wasn't just about Jessica's preferences or Michael's busy schedule. This was about who I was versus who they needed me to be. I was the wrong kind of grandmother, too emotional, too needy, too remindful of a past they were trying to transcend. They didn't want the woman who had raised Michael in a cramped apartment and worked double shifts to pay for his education. They wanted someone who matched their new aesthetic, someone whose presence enhanced rather than complicated their carefully curated life. I was the before picture in their after story, the rough draft they were trying to edit out of their final version. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. I could try harder, buy better gifts, learn more appropriate ways to express my love, but I would never be enough because the problem wasn't what I did. The problem was who I was. And that was something I couldn't change no matter how desperately I wanted to. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in September. Ordinary and unremarkable in every way except for how completely it shattered what remained of my hope. I had stopped by the grocery store where I used to take Michael when he was Tommy's age, back when a trip to buy milk could turn into an adventure if you let a curious 3-year-old help you navigate the aisles. I was standing in the cereal section, staring at the colorful boxes and remembering how Michael used to beg for the sugary ones with cartoon characters, when I heard a familiar laugh, Tommy's laugh. I turned toward the sound and saw them. My son pushing a cart while Tommy sat in the child seat, pointing excitedly at everything they passed. Jessica walked beside them, elegant even in casual clothes, occasionally reaching over to ruffle Tommy's hair or hand him a snack from her purse. They looked like something from a magazine ad for perfect families living perfect lives. For a moment, I considered approaching them. What harm could there be in saying hello, in giving my grandson a quick hug, in existing for just a few minutes in their presence? But as I watched, I realized they hadn't seen me. I was standing 15 feet away from my own family, and I might as well have been invisible. That's when I heard Tommy speak. Really speak. Not just the babbled words I remembered from our last brief encounter months ago. "Daddy, can we get cookies?" His voice was clear, confident, full of personality. "What do you say when you want something?" Michael prompted gently. "Please, pretty please with sugar on top." They all laughed, and Jessica leaned down to kiss the top of Tommy's head. "You're getting so good with your words, sweetheart. Grandma Diane is going to be so excited to hear you on our video call tonight." Grandma Diane. Weekly video calls. Regular conversations with a grandmother who got to witness Tommy's language development, who knew his favorite phrases and silly expressions, who was part of his daily routine in ways I could only dream about. I stood there holding a box of oatmeal I didn't remember picking up, watching my grandson perform for an audience that didn't include me, listening to him speak in full sentences I was hearing for the first time. He had learned to talk, to express his wants and needs and personality, and I had missed all of it. They moved on to the next aisle without ever noticing me, and I remained frozen in place, surrounded by breakfast cereals and the crushing realization that Tommy was growing up without me in any meaningful way. I wasn't part of his vocabulary, his daily experiences, his understanding of who belonged in his world. I went home and sat in my chair, the same chair where I'd rocked Michael through countless nights when he was sick, where I'd helped him with homework and listened to his teenage problems and celebrated his college acceptance letter. Now it was just furniture in an empty apartment, holding a woman who had outlived her usefulness to the people she loved most. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I poured myself a glass of wine. cheap wine from a bottle that had been sitting in my cabinet for over a year, and I let myself cry. Not the careful, silent tears I'd been rationing for months, but deep, ugly sobs that came from a place so raw I didn't know it existed inside me. I cried for the grandmother I'd planned to be and would never become. I cried for the relationship with Tommy that existed only in my imagination. I cried for my son, who had learned to love me conditionally and found those conditions impossible for me to meet. I cried for the version of myself that had believed love was enough, that good intentions mattered, that being someone's mother meant something permanent and unshakable. When the tears finally stopped, I felt empty in a way that went beyond sadness. It was the hollow feeling of having nothing left to lose, because everything valuable had already been taken. I stopped calling. What was the point? My calls were interruptions to be managed, obligations to be fulfilled with minimal effort and maximum efficiency. I stopped sending gifts, stopped making suggestions about visits, stopped trying to insert myself into a life that had no room for me. The silence that followed was deafening, but also telling. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and nobody noticed my absence. My phone didn't ring with concerned inquiries about why I'd gone quiet. No one asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if perhaps my silence meant I was hurt or sick or struggling. Their lives continued seamlessly without me. Proof that I had been right about my dispensability. I began to understand what it meant to be truly alone in the world. Not just physically alone. I'd been that since my husband died. But existentially alone. Unimportant to the continuation of any story that mattered. I was a woman without purpose, a mother without children who wanted her, a grandmother whose grandchild didn't know her name. My days became smaller, my world more contained. I went to work at the library, came home to my empty apartment, ate simple meals while watching television shows that helped me forget my own life for a few hours. Weekends stretched endlessly before me, filled with household chores that needed doing and books I pretended to enjoy reading. Sometimes I would drive past their house, not to see them, but to punish myself with evidence of their happiness. The lawn was always perfectly maintained. Jessica's car sparkled in the driveway. Children's toys scattered across the front porch suggested a life full of activity and joy. They had built something beautiful together, and it was complete without me. But somewhere in the depths of that autumn, when the leaves were dying and the world was preparing for winter, something shifted inside me. It wasn't hope. I had learned not to trust that dangerous emotion anymore. It wasn't anger either, though that would have been easier to sustain than the numbness I'd been carrying. It was something quieter, but more solid. A recognition that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of more than simply existing in the margins of a story that no longer included me. I had survived losing my husband, raising a child alone, working jobs that barely paid enough to keep us afloat. I had survived poverty and uncertainty, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying more than you thought possible. Maybe I could survive this too. One evening in late October, as I sat in my chair watching the sunset through my small window, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to disappear just because they had decided I was inconvenient. I wasn't going to waste away quietly in this apartment, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they might occasionally throw my way. I was going to remember who I was before I became the woman who begged for her own family's love. I was going to reclaim something I'd lost in all those months of trying to make myself acceptable to people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. I didn't know what that meant yet, didn't have a plan or a grand gesture in mind, but for the first time in months, I felt something other than emptiness. Not hope exactly, but possibility. Not strength yet, but the memory of what strength felt like. I still had something left. Something they had forgotten about. Something even I had nearly forgotten in my desperation to belong where I was no longer wanted. I still had myself, and maybe, just maybe, that was going to be enough. The change didn't come with fanfare or dramatic revelation. It started with small things, quiet observations that accumulated like snowflakes until they formed something substantial enough to stand on. I began to notice how differently I moved through the world when I wasn't constantly bracing myself for rejection. At the library where I worked part-time, I found myself actually listening to the patrons who came to me for help instead of just going through the motions while my mind churned with anxiety about my next failed attempt to connect with my family. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who visited twice a week to read magazines she couldn't afford to buy, started staying to chat after she'd finished browsing. She told me about her grandson who was studying engineering, about her daughter who worked too many hours but called every Sunday without fail, about the garden she maintained in the tiny plot behind her apartment building. "Family is complicated," she said one afternoon, settling into the chair beside my desk with the comfort of someone who had learned that some conversations couldn't be rushed. "Sometimes the people who should love us most are the ones who hurt us deepest. But that doesn't mean we stop being worthy of love." I looked at her more carefully then. This woman whose English carried the careful precision of someone who had learned it as an adult, whose clothes were clean but clearly mended, whose eyes held the particular wisdom that comes from surviving losses I couldn't imagine. "How do you know when to stop trying?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could reconsider them. "Mrs. Chen smiled, and something in her expression reminded me of my own mother, who had died when Michael was still young, but who had possessed the same kind of quiet strength that didn't announce itself, but simply endured. "You don't stop loving," she said carefully, "but you stop making yourself small to fit into spaces that weren't made for you. You remember that you existed before them, and you'll exist after them, and that existence has value all by itself." That conversation stayed with me as I walked home through the November evening, past houses where families were sitting down to dinner, and children were doing homework at kitchen tables, and grandparents were probably being included in conversations about holiday plans. For the first time in months, I didn't feel envious of those glimpses of family life. Instead, I felt curious about what my own life might look like if I stopped measuring it against what I'd lost. I started paying attention to things I'd forgotten to notice during the months when all my energy had been focused on trying to regain entry to a world that had locked me out. The way the light fell through my apartment windows in the late afternoon, creating patterns on the walls that shifted and changed like a slow dance. The satisfaction of organizing the library's children's section, creating displays that would help parents find books their kids might love. The quiet pleasure of cooking simple meals for myself without having to consider anyone else's preferences or dietary restrictions. I rediscovered routines that belonged to me alone. Saturday morning coffee while reading the newspaper cover to cover, something I hadn't done since I'd started spending my weekends hoping for phone calls that never came. Long baths with library books propped on the edge of the tub, letting myself sink into other people's stories instead of obsessing over my own. Evening walks through my neighborhood, learning the names of streets I'd lived near for years but never really explored. During one of these walks, I found myself in front of the elementary school where Michael had attended kindergarten through 5th grade. The playground equipment had been updated since then, but the building itself looked the same. Red brick, large windows, the same welcoming entrance where I'd dropped him off for his first day and picked him up after school plays and parent-teacher conferences. I remembered the mother I'd been then, confident, involved, certain of my importance in my child's life. I'd volunteered for field trips, helped with classroom parties, attended every performance and presentation. The other parents had known my name, included me in their conversations, assumed I belonged in the ecosystem of people who shaped their children's daily experiences. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, someone I'd lost along the way between Michael's childhood and his current life. But standing there looking at the school where she'd been so present and purposeful, I realized she hadn't actually disappeared. She'd just been buried under months of self-doubt and desperate attempts to become someone more acceptable. I started thinking about what Mrs. Chen had said about existing before and after the people who had hurt us. I had been someone before I became Michael's mother, a young woman with dreams and opinions and the kind of resilience that had gotten me through my husband's death and single parenthood and years of financial struggle. I had been someone after Michael grew up and moved out, a woman who had built a quiet but satisfying life around work she enjoyed and small pleasures she'd earned through decades of responsibility. Somewhere in the panic of losing my place in his new family, I'd forgotten that version of myself existed. I began to remember things I'd loved before my world had shrunk down to the size of my grief. I'd always enjoyed gardening, but I'd given up my small balcony garden when I became too depressed to maintain it. Now I found myself researching indoor plants that could thrive in my apartment's limited light, planning a small project that would belong entirely to me. I'd once been an excellent baker, known among Michael's friends for cookies that disappeared as fast as I could make them. I hadn't baked anything in months, but one Sunday afternoon, I found myself mixing dough for the lemon bars my husband had loved, filling my apartment with smells that brought back memories of better times. The lemon bars turned out perfectly, and I ate one slowly with my evening tea, savoring the tart sweetness and the simple satisfaction of creating something beautiful with my own hands. I didn't think about who else might enjoy them or wish I had someone to share them with. They were mine, made for my own pleasure. And that was enough. I started visiting the community center where I'd taken that computer class months ago. Not for any particular program, but just to be around people who weren't measuring my worth against my usefulness to them. There was a book club that met Tuesday evenings, a gentle group of mostly older women who read everything from classic literature to modern mysteries, and discussed them with the enthusiasm of people who genuinely enjoyed learning from each other. "We'd love to have you join us," said Patricia, the group's informal leader. When I mentioned that I'd overheard their discussion of the current selection and found their perspectives interesting. "We're always looking for fresh viewpoints, and you clearly know your way around books." The invitation was simple, uncomplicated by hidden agendas or careful calculations about whether I was the right kind of person for their group. I accepted, and the following Tuesday found myself sitting in a circle of folding chairs, listening to passionate debates about character motivations and thematic elements, with people who cared more about the quality of ideas than the social status of the person expressing them. For 2 hours, I was just Barbara, not the rejected mother, not the unwanted grandmother, not the woman who had failed to meet someone else's standards for acceptable family members. I was someone whose opinions mattered, whose insights were welcomed, whose presence added something valuable to the conversation. Walking home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The simple pleasure of being seen and appreciated for who I actually was rather than dismissed for who I wasn't. I began to understand that the problem hadn't been my inadequacy. The problem had been trying to force myself into a shape that didn't fit who I actually was. I had spent so much energy trying to become the kind of grandmother Jessica would approve of that I'd forgotten the kind of person I'd always been. Someone who loved deeply but didn't beg for attention, who offered support without requiring gratitude, who had raised a good man even if he'd forgotten where that goodness had come from. That night, I pulled out a box I hadn't opened since Michael's wedding, photographs and mementos from his childhood, report cards and school artwork and birthday party pictures that told the story of a boy who had been loved completely and unconditionally. There I was in photo after photo, younger but recognizable, holding a confident child who had never doubted his mother's devotion. I wasn't the same woman who had raised him, but I wasn't a different species either. I was older, grayer, marked by experiences he couldn't imagine, but I was still the person who had taught him to tie his shoes and helped him with math homework, and stayed up all night when he had pneumonia. I was still his mother, whether he chose to remember that or not. And I was still myself, whether his new family had room for me or not. For the first time in months, that felt like something worth remembering. The letter arrived on a Thursday in December, unremarkable in every way except for the return address that made my hands shake as I held it. Michael's handwriting, unmistakable despite the years that had passed since I'd seen it on birthday cards or thank you notes that had gradually stopped coming. I set it on my kitchen table and stared at it for nearly an hour before I found the courage to open it. During those 60 minutes, I imagined every possible reason he might have written to me. An apology, perhaps. An invitation to Christmas dinner. News about Tommy that he wanted to share personally rather than through the distant filter of social media posts I wasn't supposed to see. The reality was none of those things. "Dear Mom," it began, and even that felt strange. When was the last time he had called me Mom in writing? "I hope this letter finds you well. Jessica and I have been discussing our family situation, and we realize we may have given you the impression that you're not welcome in our lives. That was never our intention." I read that sentence 3 times, feeling something cold settle in my chest. our family situation, as if my exclusion from Tommy's life was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with better communication, rather than a systematic campaign to erase me from their carefully curated existence. "We know you've been giving us space," the letter continued, "and we appreciate your respect for our boundaries as we've navigated the challenges of new parenthood. However, we'd like to extend an invitation for you to join us for Christmas dinner this year. We think it would be good for Tommy to have more time with his grandmother." The words should have filled me with joy. 6 months ago, an invitation to Christmas dinner would have felt like answered prayers, like validation that I still mattered to them despite everything that had happened. But reading it now, with the clarity that distance had given me, I could see the careful language that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with guilt management. They weren't inviting me because they missed me, or because they'd realized how much they'd hurt me. They were inviting me because someone, maybe Jessica's mother, maybe one of their friends, had made them feel guilty about excluding a grandmother from family celebrations. This wasn't about wanting me there. It was about being able to tell themselves and others that they'd made an effort. The letter went on to specify the details with the kind of precision that made my stomach hurt. Dinner would be at 2:00. I should bring a side dish, nothing too elaborate, maybe a simple vegetable or salad. They would understand if I needed to leave early, as they knew holiday gatherings could be overwhelming for people who weren't used to them anymore. As if I had become some kind of hermit who might find normal family interaction too stimulating to handle. As if my months of absence from their lives had been by choice rather than by design. But it was the final paragraph that revealed the true nature of this invitation. "We're also excited to share some news with you in person. We've been keeping it quiet until we were ready to announce it publicly, but we're expecting another baby in the spring. We thought you'd want to know. Another baby. Another grandchild who would be raised by Jessica's standards, surrounded by Jessica's family, growing up with the same careful distance from me that Tommy had been taught to maintain." They weren't inviting me to Christmas dinner because they wanted to include me. They were inviting me to Christmas dinner because they needed a witness to their announcement, someone to play the role of grateful grandmother receiving wonderful news. I folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, then sat in my quiet kitchen and tried to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't the desperate gratitude I would have experienced months ago, when any acknowledgement of my existence would have felt like a gift. It wasn't even anger, though perhaps it should have been. It was something much more dangerous. Clarity. I could see exactly what this invitation was. A performance designed to ease their consciences and provide them with evidence that they had tried to include me. I would attend their carefully controlled dinner, express appropriate joy about the pregnancy announcement, and leave with whatever scraps of interaction they deemed sufficient to fulfill their obligation to me. Then they would return to their normal routine of excluding me while telling themselves they had made an effort. The old Barbara would have accepted immediately, would have spent days planning what to bring and what to wear and how to make the most of this precious opportunity to be in Tommy's presence. The old Barbara would have been grateful for any invitation, no matter how conditional or carefully limited. But I wasn't the old Barbara anymore. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. Instead, I went about my week with a strange sense of calm that surprised me. At the library, I helped patrons find the books they needed and organized the holiday display with the same quiet efficiency I'd always maintained. At book club, I participated in a lively discussion about the novel we'd read, offering insights that my fellow members seemed to value and appreciate. Mrs. Chen stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to browse the magazines, but really to check on me in the way she'd been doing since our conversation about family complications. "You seem different," she observed, settling into her usual chair beside my desk. "Peaceful, maybe, like you've decided something important." "Maybe I have," I said, surprised by how true that felt, even though I wasn't entirely sure what I'd decided yet. "Good decisions usually feel quiet," she said with a small smile. "The loud ones are often the ones we make when we're scared or desperate. The quiet ones come from a deeper place." That evening, I called Patricia from book club and asked if she'd like to join me for coffee the next day. We'd been talking after meetings for weeks, but this felt like something more, reaching out to build a friendship rather than just participating in a group activity. "I'd love that," Patricia said. and I could hear genuine warmth in her voice. "There's a lovely little cafe downtown that I've been wanting to try. Would that work for you?" It occurred to me that I couldn't remember the last time someone had asked what would work for me, what I might prefer, what would make me comfortable. The invitation felt like a small miracle, the ordinary kindness that most people took for granted, but that had been absent from my life for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like. Over coffee the next day, Patricia and I talked about books and travel and the small adventures that made ordinary life interesting. She told me about her daughter who lived in Portland and her son who was teaching English in Japan, about the garden she was planning for spring and the cooking class she was considering taking at the community center. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "What are you looking forward to?" The question caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had asked what I was looking forward to, as if my future held possibilities worth exploring rather than just days to be endured? "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think I'm still figuring that out." "That's wonderful," Patricia said, and something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. "There's something exciting about being at a place where you get to decide what comes next, don't you think? So many people never get that opportunity. They just follow the path someone else laid out for them." Driving home, I thought about what she'd said. For months, I'd been thinking of my situation as a loss. The loss of my place in Michael's family, the loss of my role as grandmother, the loss of the future I'd imagined. But maybe it was also an opportunity, the chance to build something that belonged to me alone, something that couldn't be taken away by other people's decisions about my worthiness. That night, I took Michael's letter out of its envelope and read it again. This time, I noticed things I'd missed before. The careful way he'd avoided any acknowledgement of how they'd treated me, the assumption that I would be grateful for whatever access they offered, the complete absence of any apology or recognition that they might have been wrong. They weren't inviting me to Christmas because they'd missed me. They were inviting me because it served their purposes to do so. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether serving their purposes was more important than preserving my own dignity. I sat down at my kitchen table with a piece of paper and began to write. Not an acceptance, not a rejection, but something else entirely. Something that would let them know that the woman they thought they could manage and manipulate had learned to value herself differently. The words came slowly but steadily, each sentence a small act of reclaiming something I'd given away too freely. I wasn't angry, wasn't dramatic, wasn't demanding anything I knew they couldn't give. I was simply being honest about who I was and what I deserved, and letting them decide how to respond to that honesty. When I finished writing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The quiet satisfaction of speaking my truth without apology or explanation. Whatever happened next would happen, but it would happen to a woman who remembered her own worth. The phone rang at 11:37 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after I'd mailed my response to Michael's Christmas invitation. I knew it was him before I answered. That particular urgency in the ring that comes when someone calls because they have to, not because they want to. "Mom." His voice was tight, controlled in the way he'd learned to manage difficult conversations during his years in corporate finance. "We need to talk about your letter." "What about it?" I asked, settling into my chair with the cup of tea I'd been preparing when the phone interrupted my quiet morning routine. "What about it?" He sounded genuinely bewildered, as if my response had been written in a foreign language he couldn't comprehend. "Mom, you declined Christmas dinner. You said you were too busy with other commitments." "What other commitments? You don't have... what could be more important than spending Christmas with your family?" There it was. The assumption that had governed our relationship for months. That I existed in a vacuum, waiting patiently for whatever attention they might occasionally spare for me. That my life held no value or meaning beyond my availability to serve their needs when it suited them. "I joined a book club," I said calmly. "We're having a holiday potluck on Christmas Day. Patricia, she's the group coordinator, invited me to help organize it, and I said yes." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to take several sips of tea and watch a cardinal land on the bird feeder I'd hung outside my kitchen window the week before. When Michael finally spoke, his voice carried a note I'd never heard before, something that might have been panic. "You can't be serious. Mom, this is Christmas. This is family. You're choosing strangers over your own grandson? I'm choosing people who value my company over people who invite me as an afterthought, I replied, and was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I'm choosing to spend the holiday with friends who actually want me there, rather than family members who see my presence as an obligation to be managed. That's not fair. His voice was rising now, losing the careful control he'd maintained at the beginning of the conversation. We invited you. We specifically reached out because we wanted you to be part of Tommy's Christmas. How is that not wanting you there? I almost laughed. Almost. The same man who had allowed his wife to systematically exclude me from every significant moment of his son's life was now acting wounded because I had the audacity to decline their carefully conditional invitation. Michael, I said, and something in my tone must have warned him that this conversation was about to go places he wasn't prepared for. When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed something, not because Jessica suggested you should, but because you actually wondered whether I was okay. The silence was answer enough. When was the last time you invited me to spend time with Tommy that wasn't a major holiday or special occasion? When was the last time you included me in a normal, ordinary day of your life? Mom, that's not... We've been busy, you know that. Starting a family is complicated, and Jessica has very specific ideas about what kind of grandmother your son should have, I finished for him. I know, Michael. I've known for months. The question is whether you know. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could practically feel his discomfort radiating through the phone connection. This wasn't the conversation he'd planned to have. He'd expected to call and straighten out whatever misunderstanding had led to my inexplicable refusal of their generous invitation. He'd expected me to be grateful, apologetic, eager to make amends for my temporary lapse in judgment. Jessica thinks, he began, then stopped himself. Jessica thinks what? I prompted gently. She thinks you've been putting pressure on us, making us feel guilty about our choices. She says you don't respect our boundaries, that you're too emotional about everything, that you make Tommy uncomfortable with how intense you are about trying to connect with him. Each accusation hit like a physical blow, but I found myself able to absorb them without crumbling. Maybe because I'd been expecting them for months, or maybe because I'd finally learned to distinguish between what was true and what was convenient for other people to believe. Too emotional, I repeated. Too intense. I suppose showing love for my grandson qualifies as both of those things. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We're trying to include you. We're having another baby, and we want you to be part of that child's life too. But you have to understand that things are different now. We have different expectations, different standards. Different standards for what? For family members. For the kind of influence we want in our children's lives. Jessica's family is very involved, but they understand boundaries. They don't push. They don't demand more attention than we're comfortable giving. They support our decisions instead of questioning them. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the man who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to tell me everything about his day over after-school snacks, who used to hug me so tightly I could barely breathe and tell me I was the best mom in the world. Michael, I said finally, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you broke Mrs. Patterson's window with a baseball? What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what I told you when you came home crying because you were scared you'd get in trouble? The silence stretched between us, and I wondered if he remembered anything about the mother who had raised him, or if that woman had been completely erased by his new understanding of what family should look like. You said... His voice was quieter now, uncertain. You said that mistakes don't define us, but how we handle them does. You said that facing up to what we've done wrong is what makes us grow into better people. That's right. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I said next would change everything between us, possibly forever. So I'm wondering what you think you need to face up to, Michael. What mistake you might need to acknowledge in order to become the kind of man I raised you to be. The silence that followed was different from the others. Heavier, more loaded with implications neither of us was quite ready to address directly. Are you saying I've made a mistake? He asked finally. I'm saying that the son I raised would never have allowed anyone to treat his mother the way I've been treated for the past year. I'm saying that the man I'm proud of wouldn't have stood by while his wife systematically excluded me from his child's life. I'm saying that the person I taught to value loyalty and kindness seems to have forgotten those lessons when they became inconvenient. I could hear him breathing, could sense the internal struggle playing out in the silence between us. Jessica is my wife, he said finally. I have to support her decisions. I have to put my family first. I was your family first, I said quietly. For 18 years, I was your only family. I put you first through everything. Your father's death, financial struggles, every crisis and challenge we faced together. I never asked you to choose between me and anyone else because I never imagined you'd have to. That's not the same thing, isn't it? When Jessica decided I wasn't the right kind of grandmother for her children, you chose to support that decision rather than stand up for the woman who sacrificed everything to raise you. When she made it clear that my presence was unwelcome in your home, you chose her comfort over my feelings. When she systematically excluded me from every meaningful moment of your son's life, you chose to enable that exclusion rather than fight for my place in your family. Mom, his voice cracked slightly, and for a moment I heard the boy he used to be underneath the man he'd become. I'm not asking you to choose anymore, Michael. I'm making the choice myself. I'm choosing to spend my time with people who value what I have to offer instead of people who see me as a problem to be managed. I'm choosing to invest my love in relationships that give me something back instead of relationships that drain me dry and leave me grateful for scraps. What are you saying? I'm saying that when you're ready to remember who I am and what I mean to you, when you're ready to stand up to your wife and insist that your mother deserves better than the crumbs she's been offering, when you're ready to be the man I raised instead of the man she's molded you into, then call me. Until then, I'll be living my life with people who actually want me in it. Art? The silence that followed felt final, conclusive in a way that made my chest tight with grief for what we were losing and relief for what I was finally gaining. Mom, you can't be serious about this. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, I said, and realized as I spoke the words that they were absolutely true. When I hung up the phone, my apartment felt different. Not empty, but spacious. Not lonely, but peaceful. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for anything or hoping for anything or trying to make myself into something I wasn't. I was just Barbara, sitting in my chair with my tea, watching birds at my feeder, perfectly content with my own company and my own choices. 3 weeks passed in the kind of peaceful quiet I'd forgotten existed. No anxious checking of my phone for messages that never came. No carefully worded texts trying to maintain connection with people who didn't want me connected. No desperate hope that this holiday or birthday or random Tuesday might be the day they remembered I mattered. Instead, I had Patricia calling to discuss book selections and Mrs. Chen stopping by the library with stories about her garden and holiday potluck planning sessions, where my opinions were not only welcomed but actively sought. I had a life that belonged to me, filled with people who saw me as Barbara rather than as someone's inconvenient mother or inadequate grandmother. The book club's Christmas potluck was everything Michael's invitation hadn't been. Genuine, warm, unstructured in the best possible way. Patricia's apartment overflowed with laughter and conversation. People genuinely interested in each other's stories, sharing food made with care rather than obligation. I brought my lemon bars, the same recipe that had once been Michael's favorite, and watched them disappear as people asked for the recipe and complimented my baking with the kind of authentic appreciation I'd forgotten was possible. "You seem different," said Elena, one of the newer members who worked as a nurse at the county hospital. "More settled somehow, like you've found your footing." "Maybe I have," I said, and meant it completely. It was during our discussion of January's book selection, 3 days after New Year's, that my phone rang with the urgent tone that meant someone needed me immediately. But it wasn't Michael's name on the screen. It was Jessica's, and that sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "Barbara?" Her voice was shaking, stripped of the careful politeness that had characterized every previous conversation we'd had. "Please, I need you to come to the hospital. It's Michael. He's been in an accident and he's asking for you." The world tilted sideways. Whatever anger or hurt or protective distance I'd built up over the months disappeared instantly, replaced by the primitive terror that comes when your child is in danger. It didn't matter that he was 32 years old. Didn't matter that he'd chosen his wife's preferences over my feelings. Didn't matter that he'd allowed me to be systematically excluded from his life. He was hurt, and he was asking for me, and nothing else in the universe mattered. "I'm on my way," I said, already reaching for my coat and keys. "Which hospital?" "Mercy General. Emergency room." "Barbara, please hurry. The doctors say the next few hours are critical." I drove through evening traffic with the kind of focused intensity that made everything else disappear. Other cars, traffic lights, the radio playing songs I didn't hear. All that existed was the need to get to my son, to be wherever he needed me to be, to do whatever a mother does when her child's life hangs in the balance. The emergency room was a chaos of fluorescent lights and urgent voices, and that particular smell of disinfectant mixed with fear that hospitals always carried. I found Jessica in the waiting area, her perfect composure completely shattered, her designer clothes wrinkled and stained with what looked like coffee and tears. "What happened?" I asked, sitting beside her without thinking about all the months of careful distance between us. "Car accident," she said, her voice hollow with shock. "Black ice on the highway. His car went off the road and hit a tree. They said if the paramedics had gotten there even 5 minutes later." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak the possibility that neither of us was prepared to acknowledge. "Where is he now?" "Surgery. They're trying to stop internal bleeding. Barbara, I'm so sorry about everything. I know I haven't been fair to you, but he kept asking for you, even when he was barely conscious. He kept saying, 'I need my mom, I need my mom,' and I realized..." She broke down completely then, sobbing with the kind of raw grief that made my own anger seem petty and irrelevant. "Shh," I said, doing what mothers do automatically, offering comfort even when it's the last thing you thought you wanted to give. "He's going to be okay. Michael is strong, and he's a fighter. He's going to be okay." We sat together in that terrible waiting room silence, two women who had spent months seeing each other as enemies united by love for the same man and terror at the thought of losing him. Jessica told me about the weeks since our phone conversation, how Michael had been distracted and distant, how he'd started questioning things he'd never questioned before. "He asked me why we never invited you for Tommy's birthday," she admitted, her voice small and ashamed. "He wanted to know when we'd stopped including you in normal things, everyday things." I tried to explain about boundaries and different parenting styles, but he just looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, eventually. That I felt threatened by how much Tommy loved you when you were around. That I was jealous of the way Michael's face lit up when he talked about his childhood with you. That I wanted to be the most important woman in their lives. And I saw you as competition instead of family." It was the first completely honest thing she'd ever said to me, and it arrived wrapped in crisis and regret, but felt like a gift nonetheless. "He started calling you after that," she continued. "Every day for a week. But you never answered, and he said he deserved that he'd lost the right to expect you to be available whenever he decided he needed you." I closed my eyes, remembering those calls I'd ignored, the voice messages I'd deleted without listening to, the messages where his name appeared on my screen and I'd chosen my own peace over his attempts at reconciliation. I'd been so focused on protecting myself that I'd missed his efforts to bridge the gap between us. "Mrs. Morrison?" A doctor in surgical scrubs approached us, and both Jessica and I stood up as if pulled by the same string. "Your son is stable. The surgery went well, and we were able to repair the internal damage. He's going to need time to recover, but he's going to be fine." The relief was so intense it made my knees weak. Jessica grabbed my arm, and for a moment we held each other up while the terror of the last few hours slowly drained away. "Can we see him?" I asked. "He's still sedated, but you can sit with him. Fair warning, he's been asking for his mother pretty consistently whenever he's conscious." Jessica and I looked at each other, and something passed between us that felt like understanding, maybe even the beginning of respect. "You go first," she said quietly. "You're who he's been asking for." Michael looked impossibly young lying in that hospital bed, connected to machines that monitored his vital signs and delivered medications that would help him heal. His face was bruised and swollen, but he was breathing steadily, and when I took his hand, his fingers tightened around mine with surprising strength. "Mom?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." "I'm sorry," he said, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes. "I'm so sorry about everything. I forgot who you were. I forgot who I was supposed to be." "Shh. Rest now. We'll talk about everything later." "No," he insisted, with the stubborn determination I remembered from his childhood. "I need to say this. You were right about everything. About Jessica. About how we treated you. About what kind of man I was becoming. I let her convince me that you were the problem, but you were never the problem. You were just inconvenient for the life she wanted us to have. Michael, I want you back," he said urgently. "In our lives. In Tommy's life. In everything. I want my son to know his grandmother, the real one, not some sanitized version that fits someone else's idea of what's appropriate. I want him to learn to bake from you and hear stories about his grandfather, and understand that his father came from somewhere real and meaningful." I squeezed his hand and let myself cry for the first time since this ordeal began. Not tears of grief or fear, but tears of relief so profound they felt like a cleansing. "We'll figure it out," I said. "All of it. But right now, you just need to get better." When I left his room an hour later, Jessica was waiting in the hallway with Tommy sleeping in her arms. He'd grown so much since I'd seen him last, his face losing the baby roundness and developing features that looked more like Michael every day. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked, and it was the first invitation she'd ever offered that came without conditions or reservations. Tommy was warm and solid in my arms, heavier than I remembered, but still small enough to curl against my chest. He stirred slightly, opened his eyes, and looked at me with the kind of sleepy curiosity that children reserve for faces that seem familiar but can't quite be placed. "Hi, Tommy," I whispered. "I'm your Grandma Barbara." He studied my face with serious concentration, then reached up to touch my cheek with one small finger. "Gamma?" he said experimentally. "That's right, sweetheart. Gamma." Jessica and I spent the next week taking turns at Michael's bedside while he recovered. And somewhere in those long hours of waiting and worry, we began to build something that might eventually become a relationship. Not friendship exactly. Too much had happened for that. But understanding, respect, maybe even partnership in loving the same people. 6 months later, I was where I belonged. At Tommy's 3rd birthday party, helping him blow out candles on a cake I'd made myself. Listening to him tell anyone who would listen that his Gamma made the best cookies in the whole world. Michael was fully recovered, stronger than before in ways that had nothing to do with his physical healing. And Jessica was pregnant again, glowing with happiness and excitement about expanding our family. Our family. The phrase still sometimes surprised me, but it felt true now in ways it hadn't before. I learned that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you're willing to walk away from. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to miss you enough to remember why they need you. And sometimes love means standing up for yourself so clearly and completely that the people who matter most finally understand they have something worth fighting for. I was Barbara again. Not just Michael's mother or Tommy's grandmother, but myself. And that, I discovered, was enough foundation to build anything on.